Good afternoon and welcome to this really exciting event around the Sustainable Development Goals here from DMU. It's really good to see so many of you booked onto the event today. Absolutely fantastic. My name's Carl Letton. I am the Sustainability Manager here at Montfort University and I'll be chair of today's session. Really pleased to be joined by our Interim Vice Chancellor, Andy Collop, and our distinguished guest, Ambassador Camus, and we'll be hearing from them shortly. As part of the session, there will be an opportunity to ask questions a bit later on. So if you do have any comments or questions that you'd like to ask, please post them in the comments section, and we'll get through as many of them as we can towards the end of the session. So to kick things off, I'd like to introduce our Interim Vice Chancellor, Andy Collop.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Sustainable Development Goal Conference. As Carl has said, I'm Andy Collop and I'm the Interim Vice Chancellor of De Montfort University. So I want to say one or two things about this event to start with. This event was created by DMU's SDG Hub and also the DMU Sustainability Team. And these are two areas of the university which really demonstrate our commitment to sustainability and celebrate the expertise we have to drive the agenda and the global goals forward. We're really delighted this afternoon to have Ambassador Macharia Camus, recognised globally as the co-designer of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, which in itself is a remarkable feat, and has provided an international framework to solve the biggest challenges facing our world. I'm also really proud to say that De Montfort University is the only UK-based United Nations Impact Hub for SDG Sustainable Development Goal 16, which is peace, justice and strong institutions. And we're one of 17 worldwide SDG hubs. Now, we're very honoured to be a hub and we take this responsibility very seriously. A considerable amount of activity is going on in the university to underpin our work to progress SDG 16 and indeed all of the SDGs with research and teaching to ensure that we hit the targets and indicators that will make communities both locally and internationally peaceful, equitable and sustainable. Our hub is leading a project with Leicester City Council to follow the United Nations call Build Back Better and enable a greener, fairer recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic and create an agenda that leaves no one behind in the process. Our hub also seeks to raise the awareness of the SDGs amongst students, staff members and the general public with informative messages across a multitude of channels, encouraging them to get involved in local projects and simple things like letting them know how they can contribute towards the SDGs in their daily lives. Students inspired by today's event are encouraged to contact the hub to become DMU SDG activist diplomats and get involved in the COVID-19 recovery or work on the many UN campaigns through their courses and that the hub offers. And students will be contacted about this opportunity after today's event. Today, Ambassador Camus will launch our Sustainable DMU strategy, which fully embraces sustainability throughout the university with the engagement of staff, students and the wider DMU community. I think it's fair to say that sustainability is at the heart of what we do at DMU, and our campus offers many opportunities to allow us to make more sustainable choices through things like the products we buy, the services we contract, what we teach and how we teach, and the way that we manage our campus. We've got bold visions for our sustainable future here at DMU, from supporting our city's climate emergency response to making our campus and its operations carbon neutral in a timely manner. Now I'd like to hand over to Ambassador Macharia Camus. Ambassador Camus is co-designer of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals and wrote the book Transforming Multilateral Diplomacy, the inside story of the SDGs about how this global framework was achieved and agreed by all 93 nations member states, which is a truly remarkable achievement. Ambassador Camus has had a remarkable career with the United Nations, working for UNICEF and the United Nations Development Programme for Africa. He served as Vice President of the 67th session of the UN General Assembly, co-chair of the General Assembly Working Group on the SDGs from 2012 to 2014, and co-facilitator of the post-2015 Development Agenda from 2014 to 2015. He currently serves as Principal Secretary in Kenya's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Ambassador Camus to speak here at De Montfort University today. Ambassador Camus.
Well, thank you very much, Andy. It really is a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to truly appreciate this invitation from the De Montfort University, and to recognize the incredible and wonderful work that your institution is doing. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Let me also appreciate those who got me here. I believe a lady called Alison Nokia, with whom we worked together in New York when she was a diplomat with the Bahamas embassy there, made the connection, and I have been able to take advantage of that and bring myself to this position where I'm having this conversation with you. So to all those who are involved in getting me here and to have this conversation, thank you very much for this opportunity. Let me also take this opportunity to congratulate the university. I mean, I'm really chuffed, I must say, that DMU is an SDG hub. I take the SDGs pretty personally, as you can well imagine. I spent 3.5 years of my life working on those goals and putting together the framework for the world to actually make sure that these goals were going to be adopted by all and become a part of our lived experience globally. And I can assure you it wasn't a foregone conclusion that this would be the case. There was an incredible amount of skepticism. We were in a difficult time in our history. The North, or the developed countries, were not exactly in sync with the challenges that the world was facing around development. They were not in sync with the South, or the developing part of the world. And so as we went into this process of developing the Sustainable Development Goals, which are now spoken to rather casually, which is a wonderful thing, by the way, we had no idea we'd be able to get there. We didn't even think we had the political will, let alone the technical capability to put it all together for the world. But indeed, we came together, and after 3.5 years of very complex day-to-day negotiations, debates, research, and processing of information, it all came together, and we managed to have not just the SDGs adopted, all 17 of them, but the global framework, the 2030 agenda, that provides the platform for the implementation of all these goals. So to know that there's a university out there that is acting as one of the global hubs to see that these goals are actually rolled out and implemented is fantastic. Now, it's hard to explain to people what that journey meant to try to put together all these goals and to put together the Sustainable Development Framework. So we've written a little book which tells the story. It's called Transforming Multilateral Diplomacy, the inside story of the Sustainable Development Goals. I recommend it to you because there's nothing I can do in the next few minutes to be able to explain to you the sheer complexity of having 193 delegations in a room for 3 years, trying to coordinate them, trying to get them all to focus on a common outcome from different political hues and different developmental stages, having over 2,000 development organizations, NGOs connected to that process, having over 70 international organizations and multilateral organizations from the UNICEFs of this world, the World Health Organizations, all the way to the funds and programs, and all the other institutions that deal with financing, such as the World Bank and the IMF, all together trying to work coherently towards a common goal. And at the same time, providing a platform for tens of millions of people around the world to try to engage them as a sounding board for these ideas as they are developing. So it's an extremely complex process. And the fact that it all came together as it did, in my opinion, was a near miracle and a great relief. And I'm very proud to have been an integral part of that process. You know, at the end of the day, we had 17 goals. This one, that is the one for this month, SDG 16, one would think would have been one of the easy ones: peace, justice, and strong institutions. I mean, who doesn't want that, right? It turned out to be one of the most difficult goals to negotiate. And that story is told in the book. And the fundamental reason is that the whole idea of peace is structured in a way in which it is an economic idea, not just a political idea. It's just not the absence of war. It is the manner in which countries organize themselves. It's the manner in which the international economic system is structured. It is the manner in which countries are able to exercise power and project that power. Justice is also a very conditional thing. I mean, we have countries in the world that have peace and justice. But when you go there and you talk to the people in the streets, you hear great revolt as they feel very upset about either their race, their gender, or their economic situation not being fully appreciated by those who say that there is peace and justice in the country. And all these countries had a very hard time coming together to agree on this whole idea of peace, justice, and strong institutions. Because it was strong institutions for whom? To represent what ideas? To protect what interest? So at the end of the day, it might seem like a goal that is self-evidently good, that we would all love to have, but in its implementation, in its realization, in its conceptualization, it was a very, very difficult goal to agree on. And so you can imagine, if that was difficult, what about all the other 16? So we had a grand old time for 3.5 years trying to get everybody on the same page. But at the end of the day, I think people began to realize that the primary and most important idea behind the SDGs was the need to fulfill the needs of everybody, irrespective of their race, class, religion, or gender. All of them, their needs of today. Their need to have shelter, to have food to eat, to have an income, to have a place for their children to play, all the way to the need to have the ability to industrialize, to manufacture, to have the income and the national capability to do all these things. And so balancing between the needs of today without compromising in very important ways the social, environmental, economic, and security demands of tomorrow was one of the biggest challenges that we faced. And indeed, it became very clear as time went by that that was going to be no mean feat. And the 17 goals are truly an attempt to balance those various demands and to make sure that everybody is able to fulfill their aspirations for today's happiness without undermining the security and the context in which we live and the promise of tomorrow, because that we could not afford to undermine. And indeed, getting this balance between people, planet, and prosperity, which sounds like a simple thing, was really the biggest challenge. And the fact that we overcame that balance and were able to attain that balance for everybody was in fact the biggest achievement. So that people, every individual, every one of you out there can see yourself in the SDGs. That's a huge challenge. There isn't a single SDG out there of the 17 that does not speak to any one of you out there. And that is one of the miracles, if I may say, of this outcome. And at the same time, protecting our planet so that we are able to be here and leave something for our children and future generations to enjoy, just like past generations left this place for us. And to ensure that there's equitable prosperity so that you don't have the situation that we have today of deep inequalities and inequities in our societies. And then the whole promise of participation, because there's no point of having all those things if they are decided for you, particularly as far as young people are concerned. They want to be in a world where they're fully engaged, where they feel they can participate. So that fourth P of prosperity was crucial to get right. And we all recognize in the midst of all of this that once we had the SDGs done, once we got the 2030 agenda done so that the platform was there, and once we got all the 193 countries to agree, that then we had to implement this. And it had to be implemented in a cooperative way, because you had to ensure that what the left hand was doing was consistent with what the right hand was doing, and what the north of the world was doing was consistent with what the southern part was doing. What developing countries were aspiring for did not undermine the prospects for developing countries. And all that is something that is now in our midst today and challenges us all today to get done, because that's the implementation that we are trying to see and execute. And that is why it's so crucially important for universities and other institutions around the world to take this seriously. We have seen, and I'm very pleased that DMU has decided to take up this challenge. And it's picked on certain things that are really important: teaching, research, building, health and well-being, and community engagement. You can imagine how important it is to get this message out. The teaching aspects. The teaching aspects are very broad, because all 17 goals have 167 targets. And you can metastasize that into even deeper sub-targets that need to be learned and understood by everybody in a manner in which they can engage in them. Hugely important. So universities and other institutions, all the young people who are going to come on stream to be able to ingrain in their character the ethos of the SDGs, this is hugely important. And I'm really pleased that the DMU recognizes this as as an important aspect of their work. Research, science and technology. I mean, we all know that some of these aspirations that we've built into SDGs are extremely high. We're already 5 years into implementing the SDGs. We only have 10 years to go. And in fact, after 2020, which has been a washout because of COVID, we only have 9 years to go. And we need to attain these goals. So how are we going to do that? We have to find accelerators. We have to find ways of cutting shortcuts that don't undermine our environment, that don't implode our society. So science, technology, information, and knowledge are going to be a crucial part of the delivery of this challenge. And that's why institutions and universities are so crucially important to have on board. Because without the science that is going to give us the best technology, that is going to give us the best methods of engagement, without the knowledge that's going to allow communities to come together in the most productive ways, we are just simply not going to make it. And so ensuring that universities do not just treat this as an academic exercise, but ingrain it in the lived experience of people is hugely important. And then the fact that you've picked health. I don't know whether this was pre or after COVID, but I mean, what a premonition. Here we are in the midst of the worst health crisis that the world has seen, probably since the 1920s, and the Spanish flu. And look at what a messed up job we've basically done around the world around this issue, in spite of the fact that we had the technology and we had the knowledge to be able to manage this much, much better. So clearly the link between knowledge, information, and action, that link is something that needs a hell of a lot of attention, or else we're just not going to get people to understand that unless we get the interface between the two, we're not going to get there in the right fashion. So we have 10 years, maybe 9 years to go. The SDGs need to be implemented for the good of people, all of us, for our future. They need to be implemented because the planet needs our care. The planet needs our love. The oceans are overburdened with pollution and abuse. Greenhouse gases are ruining our air and creating heat waves that are creating climatic changes that are unmanageable. Our coral reefs are under siege. These things have been said 1,000 times over, but we need to do something about it. So when we move from oceans to the earth, to the forests, to the special ecosystems, to our biodiversity, the various animals that are getting, wiped out, entire species are disappearing as we sit here. We need to do something about this. And to do this, we have to get all the SDGs right. We have to deal with poverty. We have to deal with issues of energy. We have to deal with issues of health. We have to get people properly educated. We've got to get the gender issues right, because we can't leave anyone behind, not because they are a woman or a girl, not because they are black, not because they are disabled. There is no excuse not to bring everybody along in the world that we are aspiring for. So for us, the SDGs envision a world that is not a miraculous world that is unattainable, but a very doable world, a very achievable world, a world that can allow all of us to live a very different life, where we can be proud to be part of the human race, and we can be proud to be part of the global biodiversity. We as human beings are just a single little small part of that global biodiversity. And we should not audacity ourselves a higher role that allows us to ruin and to kill all other animals and other creatures on God's green earth. So we have to get this right, and we're going to get it right. And the platform to get us there is the SDGs. As you heard in the introduction, we want to talk about building back better. And I'll end with this. Yes, we have to build back better. With this, there is no question. What the COVID situation has really demonstrated is that our smugness about our ability to control our reality is not sustainable and is absolutely lethal. We've lost an entire generation of our grandparents, tens of thousands of them, unnecessarily, because we thought we could pull this off with minimal effort. What we've come to realize is that we need to be a little bit meeker, a little bit more humble in the face of the challenges that we face, so that we can apply ourselves more sincerely to what we're trying to do. So indeed, we need to build back better, bluer, because of our oceans. We need to build back better, wider, because of our environment and our atmosphere, which is also under siege. We need to build back better, greener, because of our earth and our ecosystems that sustain us, sustain the air, the oxygen that we breathe, and absorb all those nasty greenhouse gases that we keep pumping up there with our vehicles and factories. We need to build back more equitably, because we cannot continue to live in a world where the North is rich and luxurious and the South is caught up in a vicious circle of poverty and deprivation. It's simply not on. It creates instability in our world. We need to build back more rapidly because the poor cannot wait. It's not good enough to tell them, well, we'll sort you out in 10 years. They want to be unpoor now. They want to have everything that the rest of us are enjoying now. And neither can the sick wait. So we want better systems now. And because of this, in building back more rapidly, we must also build back with a certain sense of humility and kindness towards our earth and towards the biodiversity with whom we share the space on this planet. So I'll leave it there as by way of introduction, and I look forward to having a conversation with all of you on these matters. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. That was absolutely fascinating. The sort of insight that you've given to the complexity of putting together the 17 SDGs, absolutely fascinating, and I can't honestly begin to comprehend how complex a process that must have been. Really, really fascinating. And I really loved your turn of phrase about making the SDGs a lived experience. And really that's something that we really want to do here at DMU, is to make sure that the SDGs are an active part of every student, staff, DMU communities day-to-day existence within the university. So absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. Please do send in your comments or questions that we can have a look at. If I may start with first asking, we always, in the past, we've always talked about sustainability as a balance between social, economic, and environmental issues. And for me, the SDGs provide a much more sort of granular description about what sustainable development is all about. And I just wondered how you came to 17 SDGs, and what was the process for deciding, was that less than you originally wanted or more than you originally wanted? What was the process behind that?
You know, there's a whole chapter about that in the book. The most amazing thing, Carl, is that we came from a background where we had the the Millennium Development Goals. And the Millennium Development Goals did a wonderful thing. They got everybody to realize that, you know what, it's actually possible to galvanize people around a certain amount of goals and get them to work together on them. But these were goals that were actually put together for a very specific challenge, and also were put together by bureaucrats or technocrats or technicians who basically presented them to the world as a fait accompli. And the world, of course, responded positively because there were issues that needed to be dealt with. But usually when you put together technical people, smart people from universities, they usually look for a very nice round number. You know, it's 5, it's 10, it's 15, you know, and because they feel, you know, it just has to, it packages better. And the reality is that 17 was what was palatable to this amorphous and very live beasts of a negotiation system that we were all trying to deal with and tackle with. And we didn't know whether we'd end up at 17, 10, 20. And there was acrimony at certain times with people who were obsessed with the number. Why? It must be 10. And I'm like, it really doesn't matter. What we're trying to do is to come up with a package of ideas that can help transform our lives. And whether that package of ideas is 1 or 12 or 25 is besides the point. And there was a huge debate around this. And there was one academic who said he went home to tell his mother how frustrated he was that this, you know, behemoth of a negotiation process that the United Nations had taken on a life of its own, and God forbid it's come up with 17 goals. How atrocious! And the mother said, "My God, I actually believe you had a debate. I actually believe it was difficult, because only if it was difficult and only if you had an open and uncontrolled debate can you come up with such an odd number." So, it was a bit of deep wisdom from an old lady who recognized that it really didn't matter what number. What mattered was that the aggregate of these ideas made it home. And that's what happened.
Great, thank you very much. I think we've got some questions from some of the people watching, I think. Leanne, thank you for your question. I don't know if you can read that, Mr. Ambassador. Amazing. I have a question related to SDG Goal 12, ensure sustainable consumption and production patterns. How important is this goal?
Well, it's, for those who hope to save the planet, this is one of the biggies. There is no way we can continue with the patterns of consumption and production that we've had for the last 75 to 100 years in the industrial age and expect that we are going to have a planet to live in 100 years from now. I mean, it's just not credible. We're going to be running around not with little masks to prevent COVID. We're going to be running around with huge gas masks to avoid us from suffocating from everything we'd have pumped up in the air by then, especially if we continue in the same pattern. So it's a hugely important goal. But I do want to say this, there is no goal here that is less important or more important than the other. And it is the fundamental understanding of the challenge that we are facing to develop sustainable development that allows you to begin to appreciate that every single one of those goals is crucial. It is the sum of the parts that is going to get us there. It isn't each individual goal being done well or badly. It is the collective of these goals. It is the universal effort. It is the totality of the outcome of all these goals together that is going to save people, planet, and prosperity.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Do we have another question? Thank you for your question, Jonathan. Do you think the SDGs will have to be reviewed in light of the setbacks to equitable human development likely caused by the COVID-19?
No, on the contrary. The SDGs have a built-in conceptual shock absorber for all these things that are falling out of the sky on our heads. Why? Because the SDGs anticipated all these things. If you look at the health goals, it's not like we didn't discuss the prospects of pandemics and epidemics. It's there. So it's not like we didn't, expect that this was going to happen. We actually expected it, and we began to recommend certain critical things that need to happen to ensure that we were prepared for such epidemics and pandemics. It's just that everybody chose to ignore it, or rather people picked the little target that they liked, out of the 167, and they run away with that, So we won't have to review it. Not now, not yet. We will have to double up the energy that we are putting towards building the right institutions and the right capabilities for managing the global health situation. And in fact, if we were to attain the SDGs, we would be in a much better position to deal with things like this pandemic. This would not have had the devastating impact that it had on all of us. So the pandemic reminds us that we are failing to achieve the SDGs. The pandemic does not ask us to review the SDGs.
And in a way, the 17 goals themselves provide that structure for building back better, as you outlined in your talk, you know, and addresses so many of those issues around equality, health and well-being, poverty, food hunger, so many different issues picked up.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I've got next question. Next question from Daniel. Thank you, Daniel. How can institutions be strengthened in an equitable manner globally? How can linkages to SDG 17 facilitate achievement of SDG 16?
This is a very technical question. And the response to it would have to be equally technical. But in reality, you see, it's also a very political question. Because the strengthening of institutions, first of all, presupposes that the current institutions need to be strengthened. Maybe we need to abandon some of the institutions. Maybe they're part of the inequitability of our world. Maybe there's some institutions out there that are not facilitating a more equitable world. Maybe they need to be revisited, rejigged. Are they even fit for purpose? I mean, one of the fundamental questions we have been asking is, are these institutions fit for purpose? Are they creating a more equitable world? It's a question that young people need to ask themselves. Students and researchers and thinkers and philosophers need to ask themselves, because we have misgivings that the 20th century institutions on which we are relying for 21st century transformation of our world are maybe not fit for purpose. Maybe they're just not up to the job. Do we have the political will to scrap them? Do we have the political will to do that in a manner that doesn't upend development in our world? So indeed, there are linkages to SDG 17, because it's how we put together 21st century partnerships that's going to matter. Because 21st century partnerships are going to require that young people, say, from the North and the South, work together, because they have both been disenfranchised by the consequences of 20th century development. And maybe they can see what the rest of us older folk maybe cannot see. And they need to understand that the partnerships that need to come and the institutions that need to be born of those partnerships have to be institutions that reach out to the world as one globe, and not as north, south, east, west, rich, poor, black, white. All these permutations that created such a dysfunctional world for all of us to try to make headway in the 20th century. So those linkages to SDG 17 are hugely important. And the world will not be a more peaceable world, to link it to SDG 16. And there will not be justice in our world if global institutions that are supposed to facilitate development, to facilitate justice, to facilitate greater peace, are themselves inherently flawed conceptually, operationally, and are really meant to only cater for either the rich or for just one part of our global family. So indeed, we have a huge challenge. But I don't want to begin to propose this as an insurmountable challenge. It isn't. It's a very doable challenge. And when you look at where we've come from as a human race, I mean, we have had huge transformation from barely recognizable institutions in the 18th century, which were only meant as extractive systems in a mercantilist world that was looking to accumulate capital and wealth in one part of the world, to a different kind of institution that tried to get us past that dysfunction, but ended up in the First and Second World War. And then abandoning those institutions, the League of Nations and others, and trying to create new institutions for the 20th century that did bring greater peace, but left other huge distortions in the global systems that we are now challenged, we, this current generation, to come up with new institutions that will get us to the next level. And so whether it's the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Health Organization, you name it, all these global institutions and their reflected institutions in our countries, our own systems in our own countries, will all need to be revisited with a view to try to attain a better, more peaceable, more prosperous, more equitable world. And we can do this, just like our forefathers did great things to get us to where we are today.
Great. Thank you. And thank you very much for the question. It's very, very interesting. Another question coming in from Emily. So how do we create meaningful change around SDG 13 when governments do not want to recognize the human impacts already made?
Well, Emily, I hate to break it to you, but this is not about governments. It's about us individuals making the right individual choices. Governments are not in and of themselves an outcome of their own self-will. Governments are born of decisions made by individuals either at an electoral platform or on an electoral platform, or even in the so-called dictatorships of this world by the acquiescence of people who refuse to insist that their will and their vote and their ideas will become part of the governance of their own countries. So at the end of the day, the consumption and production patterns that we spoke about earlier, that are such a fundamental part of the climate change that we are experiencing today. These are individual choices, and every single one of us young people, the choices we make by the clothes we wear, by what we choose to eat, how we choose to eat it, how we choose to travel, all these choices, everyday choices, how hot our water is in the morning when we take a shower, what kind of chemicals we use on our hair and on our bodies. These are all choices that work themselves back to impacts on climate change, on biodiversity, on pollution, and so on and so forth. And governments will only go where we want to go. And we must recognize this, that governments will only get away with what they get away with because we allow them to get away with it. And it is when we say collectively, judiciously, peaceably, that we will not allow that to happen, that governments then change their route. Thank you.
I think really good example there of the impact individuals can make. And I note that a recent film's been released about I Am Greta Thunberg's work. Excellent example of the difference that one person can make in raising awareness of important issues like climate change and encouraging action amongst governments and other institutions. Yeah, I shall definitely be going to have a look at that film. So next question comes in from Florin. So how many goals were there before getting down to 17? And why 17 goals and not 18, for example?
Well, I think I answered this question already. There were never any goals before those 17. We started with a clean slate. We didn't start with goals. We started with a challenge. How can we make our world a better place for people, planet, and for prosperity? answering that question and then asking yourself, how are you going to structure this question so that people can begin to organize themselves, is what led us to a clear set of goals to transform our world. So no, there was no number. Yes, as I said earlier, some people came with, their little Bibles. We had great thinkers who came into the room waving their book and their solution and saying, this is the solution. I have thought about this for the last so many years. But at the end of the day, they were all persuaded that a more collective and consultative way of developing these ideas was the best way forward, because you needed buying. Because without buying from all 193 countries, all the thousands of non-governmental organizations, if they didn't buy into this effort, it was never going to go anywhere. And they had to feel part of it, and they had to engage in the debate. That's why it took 3.5 years, just, to put it all together. Thank you.
A question I'd like to ask is I always sort of imagine that the SDGs are a little bit like a spider's web, where if you pull one part of the web, everything else moves and shifts as well. And I just wondered whether the interconnectedness and the joined upness of the 17 goals, was that something that just developed naturally, or was that something that you had to work quite hard to include within the goals and the indicators and targets?
Actually, that came out organically. Let's understand that the world is one. It is only us, especially the smart fellows in high learning institutions, that like to compartmentalize things and put them in little boxes. And, you're from the department of this and I'm from the department of that. It's only us who confuse things. The world is totally interconnected. It's one. Water and earth, trees and plant, flesh and air are all part of oneness. When we disappear, we don't become, something that isn't there. When we die, we become earth and air and water, and we are it. We are everything. So it isn't, there was never an opportunity for us to begin to think of this in little compartments. It was never going, the reality of transforming our world did not present that opportunity. And it couldn't, by definition, present that opportunity. Because the world is one. It's a fully integrated oneness. And that oneness, all we did was do a rather crude approximation of that oneness with those 17 goals. And it was only to make it palatable to you and me. That's all. If we were doing this for the world, literally, we would just have one goal. But we were doing it for the human race, so that the human race could begin to understand its culpability, could begin to understand its responsibility. And the only way to do that was to break it down into palatable components that human beings could begin to understand. And I see a question here from Bolatito, which I think is an interesting question. The UN Secretary General is sort of the shepherd of this, of the implementation of these goals for all of us. And the shepherd always, has a way of making sure that the herd and the sheep stay in a certain order. And so occasionally you hire Alsatians or sheepdog. Not that these 15 independent scientists are that, but it's a way of saying that without having people who can go out there to have a independent assessment of what is going on as the world tries to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, we won't know where we are. And Bolatito, if you don't measure it, you can't be accountable to it. It doesn't matter whether it's the Sustainable Development Goals, or whether it's your own personal life, if you can't measure what you're trying to achieve tomorrow or next week or next year, and you don't have milestones around which you can assess progress towards your own goals, I guarantee you, you won't know whether you're making progress going backwards or standing still. So this is a way in which the shepherd, the Sustainable Development Goals shepherd, the UN Secretary General, educates himself and the world in the process as to how we're doing in trying to meet these goals. So it's something that has to be done, that needs to be continually done, and it has impact because it helps us stay on track and reminds us, as I said earlier, we have 10 more years, 9 more years, and you have to accelerate. Where are you making progress? Where are you not making progress? Where are you failing to achieve the goals that needed to have been achieved, for example, in this year? There are certain goals that came due already, and some will come due in a couple of years, and so on and so forth. And if you're not attaining those goals, if you're not meeting those targets, then you're clearly not going to meet the ultimate objective. So that's the challenge, Bolatito, and we have to go for it.
Thank you for that question. Excuse me. Next question is from Dana Vidal. Which SDG would you say is the most directly related to the fashion industry?
One of my happiest moments in this process was to get the fashion industry on board. I never thought the day would come when I would be sitting in New York and all these grand mullahs from the fashion industry would be strutting their stuff as part of the campaign for Sustainable Development Goals. It was amazing. And Dana, I don't know if you're in that industry, but that industry is the third or the second most polluting industry on earth. The clothing industry has destroyed more biodiversity, fish, frogs, and all kinds of things on rivers, and polluted more water. The jeans you wear, making those jeans is a horrific proposition for microorganisms around the world. They'd rather you aren't wearing jeans, to be honest, because all that poisonous dye and chemical is released into our rivers and streams. You know, I bemoan the fact that I don't hear frogs anymore, because when I was growing up, it was not possible to conceive of an evening without the sounds of frogs. Now, I bet you none of you have heard a frog recently, where you live. And they didn't just go to heaven, they were exterminated by our consumption and production habits. But the good message is that fashions and textiles have recognized this and are beginning to do something about it. And they're beginning to understand that they have to produce these clothes we wear and the materials we use in a different kind of way that is more sustainable, that is more environmentally friendly, that creates a better space for the other biodiversity that is trying to live on this earth, rightfully so. And that our fashion industry, with all their chemicals and dyes, are denying them the opportunity to do so. And they're coming up with very interesting concepts. I went to a fashion show where, during the midst of all this, because there were, as I said, we had thousands of organizations involved in this, and everybody and they had come up with clothes made of fish skins. And these were fish that were going to be eaten anyway, so they were not being killed just for the fashion. And they were sustainably produced, the fish, and then they got the skin. Imagine that fine skin. And they made clothes. And there was nothing wrong with those clothes, except when it rained, of course. But it's a good way to show that the fashion industry has solutions, and we need to embrace those solutions. But if you're the number one, number two polluter on God's green earth, you have a lot of thinking to do as to where and how you want to do that business. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. So the next one is, do you agree that the developed countries forget the least developed countries at the moment?
That's a political question. Must be from a political scientist. It is an interesting question in the sense that countries don't exactly have a conscience. So to ask countries to remember or to care is to ask a lot of countries. But people do have. And if your country is forgetting other countries and is not being humanitarian in its stance and isn't being collegial in its engagement with other parts of the world, then we're all to blame and we all need to take some responsibility. But if you mean that has the COVID-19 lessened the sort of the focus of these countries, the answer is yes or no. Yes, because clearly they have to save their own people and they have to save themselves. But no, because many of these countries have come together and recognized that they're dealing with a global pandemic. The thing with the health pandemic is that it doesn't stay in one area. So you can't just take care of it in the United States or in Europe and say, hey, we are done, and the rest of you all can go figure it out. The reality is that this little virus is moving around the world rapidly, and it chooses no one because they are developed or underdeveloped, or because of their race, or because of their gender. And so they have had to understand that they need to continually engage in helping countries that are less able to manage their own health affairs better. But it's also sent a very important message that how countries invest in development also has to change. That it has to be the kind of investment that creates the institutions and the capabilities for all countries to have a certain level of development that guarantees that when you do have epidemics, that they don't find corners in the world to hide and then come back to bite you. That all countries have an equal capability to take care of a problem that might have global implications.
Thank you very much for that question. I think we've got a few more questions as well. This one's from Natasha. Seems to be an increasing trend toward nationalism, especially in the north. What impact do you think this could have on the collective attainment of the goals?
Thanks, Natasha. Nationalism is usually born of ignorance and fear. And as I said, we live in one world. So the idea of the nation state is a silly little idea that is about 200 years old or thereabouts. We've been around for like 60,000 years, we human beings. So if you have an idea that's been making a few ripples over the last 200 years, and people begin to attach themselves to it for dear life, you should ask yourself whether this is clear-headed thinking. Nationalism is born of fear and maybe even hate sometimes. But the fact that we have increasing trends of it, I think isn't entirely true. I think what we've seen is a little blip in the trend. I think we've been having lesson in nationalism, because if you want to talk nationalism, just go back to the middle of the 20th century. You will see nationalism. I mean, it was the heyday of nationalism, when countries projected themselves into the world, as Pax Britannica or some other very, very nationalistic stance. But I think we've seen that whittle down with the end of colonialism, with the rise of other nations, and the realization that we are an interdependent world, and therefore holding on to your little island state, it might not be such a clever thing if you're going to succeed in the world. You may want to sort of belong to a community, even as you Brexit. So these are things that you want to balance. So nationalism, I think, is only a reaction to the last 10, maybe 5 years of political developments. It has to do a little bit with the rise of China and the threat that people see in that. That's why I said there's a lot of fear. But it's a little unsustainable, because at the end of the day, the nation state cannot sustain itself in autarky or in isolation to other countries. So will it affect the attainment of certain goals? Without a doubt, it'll slow down some. It might even derail some for a little while. But I think the world is on a certain trajectory. And I think nationalism is not sustainable in the kind of world that most young people, who are the ones who are going to inherit this earth, really care about. But let's wait and see.
Thank you, Natasha, for that question. I think we've got time for a couple more. How can we students be part of this army to achieve these SDGs?
Yeah, Nyasha, good question. I used to say during the negotiations that the status quo has its own army. And I used to remind everybody that nobody in this room should be complacent, because in the room were troops from the status quo, shock troops who were looking to undermine the negotiations and who were going to ensure that we got nowhere and that we failed in our ambition. The status quo always has its army, Nyasha. Anything that you see out there, there's people who like to wear suits and look as smart as you look over there. You can't convince them to be different. And they will fight you tooth and nail to protect their right to live a certain way, to behave a certain way, to enjoy certain privileges, and to have certain entitlements in our world. The status quo has its army. And therefore, a sustainable world, a world that is bluer, greener, fresher, that protects the global biodiversity, needs its army. So absolutely, every student, every young person, every person, middle-aged and old, needs to get onto that bandwagon to ensure that they become part of this army. And it's not an army that is thinking of itself in the 20th century way, combat, pitch battles. We got to get out of this 20th century mentality that, of fighting and armies and all these kind of things. In the 21st century, we're in the age of persuasion. We're in the age of ideas. We're in the age where people have to be convinced. People have to be bought into. There is no way, if you take a stance that is antithetical to the other person, that the other person will not take a stance that will seek to undermine your viability. There's just no way. So the whole concept of how we engage in promoting and driving the Sustainable Development Goals in and of itself has to reflect a philosophical mindset that is fundamentally different to that dominated our behavior and our thinking in the 21st century. So those of you who are really the first cohort of students in the 21st century, have to understand that it's just not possible to continue to use language, to continue to use conceptual frameworks for structuring your thinking and your action that is embedded in thinking and behavior of the 20th century. Because if you do, we will end up with nationalism, we will end up with racism, we'll end up with armies, we'll end up with wars, and we will get nowhere. So the challenge to your professors, the challenge to yourselves, is how to move away from this thinking that was so deeply embedded in a 20th century zero-sum structured game of thrones, if you want, to something that is very different, where we are not talking about thrones, we're not talking about nations, we are talking about a common heritage, we're talking about a common world, one globe that we call home, and that none of us has greater right to it than the other. That thinking has to become deeply embedded and will rid your mind of words such as army, such as nation, such as black, white. These things will be eviscerated because they have to be if we are to attain our sustainable development goals. And actually, if we are to take them to the next level, because this is just level 1.
Thank you, Nyasha. I think we've probably got time for one more question, I think. Kutuma, thank you. The MDGs were clearly not achieved as adequately as we would have liked, hence the SDGs. Are there any mechanisms in place to ensure that the SDGs will be achieved in the remaining time?
Kutoma, the SDGs, the MDGs were, as I said earlier, a very, very important challenge to the world. The MDGs signaled to the world that the world needed to do things differently and that certain things were really intolerable in a civilized state. It was just intolerable. All these children were dying, all these people were going hungry, all these injustices were being perpetrated on women because of the agenda. It was just intolerable. And so the MDGs got us to focus on that and got us to recognize this very, very quickly. And you may say that they were not achieved, but they set the stage for everything that we are doing today. Remember, and this is a lesson for all young people, that everything is a progression. Nothing comes unless what came before it was worthy of the succession, the successive action. So we would not have the SDGs if we didn't have the MDGs. And we would not have the MDGs if we hadn't had people thinking about development in structured ways earlier. And life is about building on the successes of previous generations. And this generation must put in place the successes that will allow the next generation to attain higher outcomes, higher achievements. And so indeed, we have been thinking about this, but it's not about us. It's about you. Every single person on this platform has to ask themselves, what am I doing? How am I behaving? It's like COVID, Everybody wants to complain about COVID. But if everybody was wearing their masks, if everybody was social distancing, I guarantee you, we would not have the spread of COVID that we had. Simple. It had to find a fertile ground for bad behavior on our part. And SDGs are the same story. So we have mechanisms in place. Every country has been challenged to build the right institutions to drive the implementation of all the 17 goals. every country, including yours. Every country is expected to report on these goals regularly, every 3 or 5 years, at the high-level political forum in New York. And the reason we do that, again, is to ensure that something indeed is happening. And it doesn't matter whether it's the richest country on earth or the poorest country on earth. They must report on their progress towards the SDGs. So there are mechanisms, but it is the will of the people. It is our commitment, our collective commitment, our individual responsibility to ensure that we do what is right and what is needed to point us in the right direction and to keep us on track to achieve the SDGs. 2030 is 9 years away. 9 short years away. And we're going to be challenged to revisit these goals and ask ourselves, what next? And we can't do that with a cynical, oh, well, it failed, so, let's just, give it all up. Because if we took that attitude, we would have just stopped at the MDGs. But we did so much better, because we said, hey, we did a great job with the MDGs. We didn't do a perfect job, but we did a good enough job so that we can now aspire to something greater and better. And as we all have been told, we must never let the great be the enemy of the good. This is a mantra that I have been brought up with and trained in. And it is something that has allowed me to accept what are my achievements of today, recognizing that I'll have an opportunity tomorrow to do better. And I will seize that opportunity with a view to making this world a better place for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Katoma. I think that's a fantastic place to leave the Q&A session. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your time, for your insights into the background of delivering and putting together the SDGs. And thank you very much for your insights and thoughts in response to answering the questions from some of our students and our staff. Appreciate you're a very busy man, so thank you ever so much for your time.
Thank you.
One of the things we wanted to do at this event was really to sort of, in a way, it's 2 launches. Firstly is to launch our latest sustainability report. One of the questions in the Q&A was around, one of the responses was around reporting progress against the SDGs. And one of the ways that we do that as an institution is through our annual sustainability reports, which is available online now through the DMU website. And the report itself highlights our progress in terms of our sustainability performance and what we do on campus. Within this report, highlights our progress, and we've made some good progress. We've reduced our carbon emissions from our energy use by over 50%. We have become accredited to the Responsible Futures program, which is around embedding sustainability into teaching and learning. Responsible Futures is a really interesting program. It's run by the NUS, and as part of the program, the NUS actually train up our own students as auditors, and our students audit our progress against education for sustainable development in what we're teaching and learning. So it's a fantastic program. We'll be running the audits again at the beginning of next year, so there'll be an opportunity to get involved as part of that. It also highlights some of the other things and some of the other measures that you may not be familiar with. For example, the university has a furniture recycling scheme, and in the last year we have reused and repurposed over 750 different items of furniture, which have either been repurposed or reused within the institution itself or given to the local community. And also we've made a lot of progress in terms of developing a project around education for sustainable development and embedding sustainability into teaching and learning at DMU. And of course, also in here is details of the fantastic volunteering that students and staff have done through the DMU local program and the progress that's made within the city. And we're also very, very excited that within the past few days, we've heard that we have been shortlisted for 4 Green Gown Awards. The Green Gown Awards recognise and acknowledge best practice within the HE and FE sector around sustainability. And so we've been shortlisted for 4 awards, which are around climate action, which links into our carbon reduction work and our carbon literacy training that we're running, a category in learning and skills, which highlights the work that our Centre for English Learning and Language are doing, and they run pre-sessional sessions around teaching English, and they're using the SDGs as a way of framing that learning. Really exciting project. We've also been shortlisted in the Campus of the Future category, for where we have worked to make our buildings more sustainable in terms of their heating and cooling. And also the 4th category that we've been shortlisted in is around research with impact. And one of the questions there was around the environmental impact of the fashion industry. And so within this particular category, the application that's been shortlisted is to one of our research students who is using enzymes from fungi as a way of dyeing textiles, and thereby reducing the environmental impact of that part of the economy. Very, very fascinating project. So we've made some very good progress, but we know that there is still an awful lot more to do. And if we want to deliver a sustainable future and contribute to a low carbon city, we know that there is more that we need to do. And the university itself is committed to this low carbon future and has made and committed to some really tough and serious carbon reduction targets. The university is committed to become net carbon zero by 2032 for its emissions from energy use, and net zero from all of its emissions by 2045. And these are really tough targets to meet, and we'll be working very hard to do that. And the only way for us to achieve these targets and continue to deliver against the 17 SDGs will be to work collectively across the university with student, staff, and the wider DMU community working together for a more sustainable future. And we want to involve you in that. And over the coming weeks and the coming months, we will be running a series of consultation activities whereby we want you to become engaged with that process and help us develop a new sustainability strategy for DMU, which will continue to deliver reductions in our carbon emissions and ensure that we're working towards the 17 SDGs. So please do have a look out for those engagement activities, which will be advertised through the university's social media channels. If you want to follow specifically the work we do around sustainability, do follow our Sustainable DMU social media channels, which are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And the final thing for me to do really is to thank Ambassador Camus and our Interim Vice Chancellor, Andy Collop, for their time and their input. Fascinating talk, fascinating insights to how the SDGs were produced and how they're being delivered. And all that really remains is for me to thank you for attending this SDG session and to wish you a very good afternoon. Thank you very much.